Okay, so hello, John Blend. John, you are the adolescent, child and emerging adult chairperson for the interest group on the IAAGT, and we're here to
Mm,
just talk to you about that and your experience with working with young people over the years.
mm.
So, welcome.
Thank
And
you. It's good to be here.
yeah. We've a wee list of questions. We've kind of played with them a wee bit, but let's just go through each question and see where we arrive then.
Yeah.
So, who are the child and adolescent and emerging adults group?
Who is CAEAIG? We are the Child, Adolescent and Emerging Adult Group that I was asked to take over, I think, from one of the AAGT conference meetings that we had. I think might have been in Taormina back in Sicily. It
No.
was either then or it was in Toronto. I can't remember. It's age is catching up with me, Julia. So I'm not sure. But anyway, ever since I've been the host of this meeting, and way back in the days before the internet, my predecessor, somebody called Joan Benevento, who worked a lot with young people, she used to do this. But in those days, it was just within North America. In fact, just within America. So this really started to take off a little bit as the internet and everything became more of a way of doing everything.
And how long has the group been running? John, do you think?
So we've been running certainly since 20. I think my part of it has been since 2018. But I joined when I joined AAGT as it was before we added the I before we became international. I joined in 1999. So around that time and the early 2000s, I think Joan Benevento was hosting an interest group periodically and occasionally answering letters, I think by post.
And your mentor was Violet Oaklander.
Yeah, Violet. I met Violet first at the Manhattan IAAGT conference. That's AAGT. I can't. Sorry, getting this muddled. Join IAGT and get interesting conferences, folks. This was a fabulous conference in Manhattan, and I went out there partly to meet Violet and partly to meet some distant relatives who I never knew existed, who were also at Queens living around there. So yeah, I met Violet in 1999. I had been working in CAMS, that's Child Adolescent Mental Health Services in England. It's a kind of free at the point of service state health clinic for young people and their families. And I've been using Violet's first book, Windows to Our Children, for years as a kind of mini Bible and a how to do it thing, because it's a very accessible first book of hers. And Violet and I became, I went and did her training the following year in 2000. A colleague of mine had done this the year before and said, "You've got to go and do it. It's just so good." And she was right. She was absolutely right. And I was just ripe for it. And we really connected, Violet and I. And then many years later, 2010-ish, we were both having problems with health, heart problems, and being grumpy about our hospital treatment. So we kind of started emailing each other and comparing notes. We became like the Brontes for a little bit. And she really was my mentor up until her death in 2021, sadly. Really had a huge impact on my professional life. Once meeting her, and I thought there's no turning back. This is what I really want to do.
Yeah. And you can see that through your work, John. Um, so I mean, I've noticed as an adolescent therapist working with kids that there's a lot of anxiety coming into the room, OCD coming into the room.
Yes.
And I'm often quite shocked at the volume of it, and I'm wondering what way you feel is best to support our young people's mental health today.
That's such an important and complicated question to answer because there are so many things that are impacting on young people. I think as a cohort, they have a lot more to deal with than I had when I was their age, just because of the pace of life what's sometimes called Red Queen syndrome, the idea from Lewis Carroll, the Queen in the Looking Glass, that you have to just to say where you are, you've got to keep running. And if you really want to get somewhere, you've got to go twice as fast. So society says do more with less time, more throughput. And that gets translated into education and into so many other aspects of life. Austerity means that money and time are in short supply often. The way in which we live, particularly in cities, means that there are pressures that perhaps weren't around 20, 30, 40 years ago. So these are very real. Plus we have climate change, we have war, we have the crazy politics of today. We have things like dealing with bullying, which in my day, when I was a kid, bullying usually stopped at the school dates or somewhere near there. But now with texting and sexting and all that, and your bullying person can really persecute you by following you practically into your bedroom at 2 a.m.
Yeah.
We have enough examples also of kids who are depressed as well as anxious. And we've heard a lot recently about how some of the algorithms in some of the social media can really be very unhelpful, in fact, even triggering or encouraging people to do dreadful things to themselves. I think what's really helpful is when I work with young people, even if they are 16, 17, possibly 8, and living under the same roof as their parents, and usually that means the parents are paying for any kind of therapy, or if they're going to a clinic, the parents will be involved as well as the young person. I find it helpful to meet them together and to discuss some of these pressures and to think both together and sometimes separately, what kind of language do we need to do? What is useful for a young person to know, and what might be too much or premature? Because I know some parents who will burden their young people by encouraging them to become a confidant and telling them all their money worries or all their sexual experiences in ways that really are grossly inappropriate. But sometimes it's helpful to talk with parents and the kids together to work out how we're going to navigate this complex field together.
And you mentioned, our current climate of war, and you mentioned social media and that. So I wonder, could you talk a little bit about how do we have that conversation about the state of the world, and how do we show example in regards to not being on our phones or social media or influencers, or what way do we navigate all of this new terrain that they're also familiar with? Um, and aware of, I'm sure, I imagine that there's lots of whispers about wars and what's going on, and we might kind of be thinking, well, that's too much to share, but where's the line?
Let me go backwards with your second question there, because I think it's easier to answer, although I may be giving a bit of a glib answer. By the way, if you're wondering, what's this crazy room I'm in? It's not a junkie, but I'm in my music room downstairs. But I can't carry my desktop upstairs, so you're going to have to put up with me and a lot of stuff, but that's all right.
Well, it's a wonderful room, Josh.
Thank you. How do we model? Well, the first thing we don't do is get on our phones in the middle of a session. I keep mine off. And if I'm meeting a family, I ask them to switch their phones off. I mean, if we go to the cinema, I know most of us are at home with Netflix these days instead, but if you go to the theatre, if you go out, there's usually a voice comes over the tannoy that asks you to turn your phone off. And I think what we need to do is to think about what happens at home. Do you have time where you can talk together without phones, or are you just glued to the telly or eating TV dinners? It's a problem. We don't have a proper dining table here in our place. It's too small, so we're often eating on our laps. So I have some sympathy for people who are also juggling their plates or whatever. But we need to have some time where we can, I think, put the phones away, switch them off, and just deal with each other face to face, or as much as we can. And I will encourage that to happen in a session, rather than somebody
Yeah.
We'll ask them to switch the phone off. First part of the question, which was about war, I think the worst thing we could do really is to try and sugarcoat it and pretend it's all right, dear. It won't happen. Now, I do have some therapists in other disciplines who say that if I bring in mention of the war or climate change, I'm polluting or bringing in my agenda. But I listen carefully, and I find if I listen, it comes up in all sorts of ways. Sometimes in language, slightly shielded language. And I think my job, really, maybe our job, is to be able to say, are you worried about this stuff? Or when you hear things, you hear them on social media, or you pick it up in conversations at home? What do you make of it?
Mm.
A lot of times when I'm working with young people, whether they're sort of children, young teens, middle teens, if I ask how do you feel, I often get either a blank or a sort of or the. A lot of people don't like that language. If I ask, as Violet used to, quite subtly, what did you think of that? Then I often get the
Yeah.
feeling response in the reply, oh, I hated that. They shouldn't have shown that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so, but I think what we can do is maybe encourage people, particularly using the arts and using our facility as Gestalt therapists, whatever training we have, if we're working in Gestalt, we have some knowledge about the body, about the breath, and we can help make the environment a safer, more contained environment in which we can talk about the things that worry us or depress us, and maybe not challenge too hard or even at all. If somebody says, age 16, 17, 18, well, I don't want to have kids. I don't want to bring a child into this world. It's a crazy world. It's poison. Yeah.
Mm.
I have to actually listen to that world and actually say, yeah, I guess it's really tough right now, isn't it?
Yeah.
What do you think are the worst things? Best and worst are often good questions, I find, that to kind of get in. And then I might say, how about, can you draw two pictures for me if you're up for that? But I need to ask, because they might say, God, no. And that's all
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
But if they're willing to, I say, well, how about you draw one like best case scenario, if the world becomes more peaceful, or we manage to get a handle on climate change. Just making marks on the paper. It's not going to be a pretty picture, or don't expect you to be Michelangelo.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what the lousy case or worst case? And can we have a dialogue between them? What does best case say to worst case? So that we're actually using it sometimes to do that.
And I wonder, so how do you feel that the like creative practice, non-verbal approach supports the client?
I think it's really important non-verbally. Often, one of the reasons I think I'm so passionate about the arts is because a lot of trauma and a lot of life difficulty happens pre-verbally.
Mm.
And for others, they just don't have the words to say it. If I can make a mark on paper, I can make my face in a sort of a gesture, or I can move, I can find a move, I can find something that may help me then find the words. And maybe some of my job as a therapist, like yours if you're working with young people, is to see if we can expand the range for somebody, so that they know when they're hearing these words what they might mean, and they don't just go over somebody's head. So we can
Mm.
brainstorm. And if you've lived in a very narrow environment or a very restricted environment, like a horse with blinkers that's only allowed to plough and go up and down, having some of that peripheral vision of thinking about, oh, do you know this word? Or what other words have we got here? And doing it as a collaborative exercise, so it's not
Yeah.
a test, Because
Yeah.
I think one of the hardest things for kids and young people to judge after all those years of education is that coming to see a counsellor, a therapist, a mentor, even really a pastoral care worker in the best sense in the school,
Yeah.
should be about having a place where you can just say your truth and not be picked up on it or told that's wrong or take this down. Because kids have so much testing in their lives, and
Mm.
they're often quite hyper vigilant and frightened that you're going to assess them and find them wanting.
And it's interesting too with the new neuroscience. Bridging, I find with Gestalt even that's coming
Mm,
through that just simple exercises, breathing exercises.
yeah,
Well, actually, this is a neuroscience thing. It's not just something I've concocted.
yeah,
It actually works, and how easily they'll kind of go, okay, well, let's try that.
yeah,
And it's lovely to be able to collaborate then with the new avenues that are coming in to support the nonverbal work
yeah.
that Gestaltists have been talking about for years.
Well, go right
Um,
back to Pearls, Hefline and Goodman, 1951, the experiments in there, which were what made the book a bestseller in the general public. You
yeah,
could try working with the senses, ways that people hadn't thought about. And when Violet used to work and do her trainings every summer, she living in California, she would get a bunch of oranges, one for each person, and she encourage us all to peel them, smell the pith, taste it, and then divide it into segments and pass the segments around. And what we discovered was that although oranges may look very similar, no two oranges taste exactly the same. And I like to do the sensory work when I'm training or
lovely.
supervising because I think we rely, and I do, too much on our eyes and maybe a bit on our ears, but often the other senses, which are, you know, when we moved out from the trees and we became elongated and our heads rose above and we could tear with our hands, we lost the sense of closeness to smell and taste in the way that
Yeah,
other animals have. You know, my dog, for example, will sniff everything
yeah, yeah,
before
yeah.
she eats it. It's like, is this all right? And we kind of lost that, particularly we just stuff a load of Pringles in our mouth.
It's so true, isn't it? Um, so what can what can we learn from the kids of today? And what insight can we pass on to our young people?
That's a fascinating question. I mean, there's a saying, I don't know how true it is, but I've heard it said many times that the old envy the young. And I've seen young people often being given a hard time by older people. Maybe I could blame it on Freud because he had an idea that maturation was just like this and you became more and more serious as you got older. Luckily, in Gestalt, we have a slightly different view. And we value being, although they refer it in Pearl's Hair for Line and Goodman as childish, I think being childlike is the best way to be in the world. We can learn from young people how to be childlike today, how to use technology in a way that I struggle with, you know, age 71, trying to work how to use, how to do social media is sometimes a real challenge. And give that to my stepdaughter, and it's like, shh.
Yeah,
And the generation before her even more so. I think we can learn how to adapt to this brave new world. Not always so brave. And what we can offer is a sense of continuity and a sense that, yeah, maybe previous generations, like the one I've come from, also had great fears about the world ending. You know, when I was young and an activist and campaigning against nuclear disarmament and against apartheid and all those kind of things, we had a lot of worries about the world and terrible things happening in the world. And somehow, although it's far from perfect, we have, we're still here. We're still here.
that's right. Yeah, because I mean, I remember we were sent the little white tablets in case of a nuclear explosion, or
Yes.
when I was probably I don't know what age I was, quite young then, and yeah, when you think back and you think of the fear that perhaps was instilled, and
Yeah.
yet we're all yeah,
I mean, look, you and I, you know, I'm English, you're Irish. I grew up with a kind of prescription around Irish people are to be feared. And although this was because of the Troubles. And we had the bombs in London, which bombs anywhere are scary, God forsake. It took me a long time to get through that, actually, by working in hospitals where Irish nurses were the salt of the earth, wonderful people. And then being able to actually come over to Ireland. And now I love going to Belfast. And my wife's dad, who's no longer with us, came from Sligo. So it's
That's
like
okay.
we can actually have some plasticity in our thinking as well as in our neurology. They are related. That may help me say, or help us say, well, this things may seem awful now or very challenging or weird. That might shift. I'm
Yeah,
Jewish and I
exactly.
grew up with a lot of paranoia and actually sort of, if you like, self-imposed hatred in my wider family about the religious Jews. And it wasn't until I actually got invitations about 10, 15 years ago to go and teach religious Jews, and that actually I learned to take back a lot of intergenerational projections that were completely mad and unvalid. And to think there's some great people here, and I can learn from them in the same way that they can learn from me.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. I think the other thing that young people have is a focus on climate. Because the climate is in a parlous state in a way that it didn't seem to be when I was much younger. And we really are living in a, people say drinking in the last chance saloon when it
Yeah.
comes to climate. Yeah.
Another thing I've noticed, I worked one day with adolescents a week in a
Mm.
school, and I noticed a struggle for autonomy. Uh,
Mm.
and should they have autonomy at all, even because it's much more important to be part of a gang, and they'll do anything to be
Yeah.
part of a gang. And of course, not everybody gets to be in the gang, and some people end up isolated, and I struggle sometimes with young ones in regards to how to support them in these places.
Yeah.
Because they're all love. I just see them as lovely young people and go, well, why
Yes.
would someone not want to know you?
Yeah.
You know?
I had a young guy about 17 who had just fallen in love for the first time, and his girlfriend was saying, if you're going to be with me, you got to leave the gang. And he was really torn because the gang were his band of brothers, his mates. And they'd also rescued him from, some rather nasty business because of a turf war. This postcode says, right, you cross this line and then actually we'll attack you and vice versa. And that was quite an interesting piece of work to do with him. But he had someone to graft onto, rather like, tender plant.
Mm.
I think it's really difficult if people are isolated and they don't have friends. One of the things I try and do sometimes if I'm working with people who are school age and I see the isolation or people who are being ostracized, is it? Just
Yeah.
sent to Coventry. Sometimes with one or two people with neurodiversity, I've seen that, and sometimes just with others who just didn't fit, the prevailing winds of our year are getting into, sex or rock and roll or whatever it is, and these kids aren't. So I try and work and see if I can encourage, with their permission and the founders, to speak to teachers to see if we can make a little marriage of a few people that might get together who are similar. It's like a little
Okay.
circle of friends. Sometimes you might find in the school, well, there could be a little bit of a little gardening project we could set up here for these three who are rather quiet in a rather boisterous school, a rather boisterous class, and you build the relationships that way. And I've seen
Yeah.
that working with kids in baby watching years ago when I used to co-run a baby watching scheme. I've seen an 8-year-old who really never said anything for many, many months, even with gentle encouragement from the teacher and myself. What are you noticing? This is an observation project when we're watching a mother and baby in the middle of a circle of kids for a school lesson. You do this for 2 terms or more until baby is running away, that it would be an
Lovely.
impediment to keep them there. And so you get the noisy kids and the boisterous ones, and they want to. So you're trying to actually also encourage the ones who don't say much to find their way in. And nothing happened with, I'm going to call her Julia. She was about 8, and then one day I happened to be on a different day in the area where her school was, just crossing the road, and I never met her mum. Mum was there with a stroller, a younger kid, and there's Julia. And Julia was shouted at me across the road. I nearly fell over. She said, "John, have we got baby watching tomorrow?" And I was pleased as punch. I said, "Yes, Julia, we have. Are you coming?" Yes. And that was the first time she had spoken in so many months.
Wow.
So sometimes it's just something we can gently do that will support that organic growth. And for her, it was the baby watching, because in class, she just stayed stum. And from then, you couldn't stop her.
Yeah, yeah. So who's the group open to the adolescent interest group? Who is it open to in our organization?
Yeah, and it is the child, adolescent, and emerging adult. I had
Okay.
a big discussion with Peter Phillipson some years ago, and he was actually quite helpful because he was saying, "Why do you want to change the name? It's child, adolescent." And I was pointing out to him in my long reply, which I think probably ended up under the dust somewhere, that actually the neuroscience is showing that whereas when I was young, we had an idea, fallacious idea, that maturation was done by the time you're 18. And actually, the birthday cards when you're 18 often had the key on it, the key of your door, because the idea was then you would leave
Yeah.
home at 18. And I can imagine some of you here who are parents are saying to yourselves, if only. We know it right across Europe for all sorts of reasons, cultural and economic.
Yeah.
People often don't leave home until they're 30, sometimes 40. And in the Caucasus, in Tbilisi, around that, the rural areas around there, you have 4 generations living under the same roof. The transferences and counter-transferences don't shift. People somehow all exist, but they don't move out. Nobody moves. So,
Charlie and the Chocolate Factory reminds
yeah.
me of.
So this group really was set up for anybody who has an interest in what it means to be young. And we've had some exciting research, University of Cambridge, 25th of November last year, from Alexia Mousley et al., a little group of neuroscientists looking at 5 stages in the human life cycle in terms of brain development. And they have actually taken the lead now and said, we've got to revise what the WHO and other people were saying. Adolescence doesn't finish at 25, it goes on to around 32 in Western industrial states. There are many native societies that do adolescence very differently, often much better. Um, the whole issue about how we don't do initiation into young womanhood or young manhood is a whole other story.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, we need to think of that. And I think this has really profound implications for the teaching of psychotherapy and the practice of
Absolutely.
psychotherapy.
Yeah. I trained with Bruno Stars, and
Oh,
Bruno would
yeah.
have covered a
Mm,
lot of neuroscience and
mm,
pre-development, womb space, and
yes.
perhaps before. And to look at the interruption along the way
Yeah.
and how that then may inform your adolescent years with
Yeah.
impulsive behaviors, or attachment styles, or whatever.
Mm.
And it is fascinating actually when we look at that neurodevelopment.
Well, Carl Wintervathan, who died last year, emeritus professor, fantastic researcher and musician, very interested in music. He was studying twins in utero and looking at dominance patterns and things 30 years ago.
Very interesting.
And those patterns are replicated if you see them 7 years later, 14 years later. You know, a lot of this stuff that happens very early, we can, stick with until our dying day if we don't
Well, this is it, and
modify.
I remember one of my peers said, we could be a baby in a cot and a spider could crawl across your face, and we have no idea.
Yeah,
That we're never going to remember that or know why that person had a horrendous fear of spiders, but that
yeah.
could be it. Um, yeah, well, So basically anybody can join this group,
Yeah,
and even people maybe working with adults or families or
exactly. But
groups or
I
yeah,
often find I get people who come to me and they say, my adolescence was a complete blur. I'm 35 now. I don't know how to make friends. I don't know how to do stuff because I was so
yeah,
busy getting into fights with my family over it and just surviving. So actually, sometimes it's really good to take stock, but also because, even if you're not working directly with young people, if you have an interest in what happens to the next generation or to your generation, you know, the older I get, the more I feel inclined to act my shoe size rather than my age at times, to stay young through being childlike rather than childish. And there's a wonderful quote in The Observer, I think it was, by Philip Pullman, 2005, which was all about the importance of play and being playful. And he ends the quote by saying, the best scientists, artists, and children know how to do this stuff. And we need to be playful and to experiment because the world is a really odd place and we won't get anywhere by doing what already has been done before. And if we think of Kurt Lewin's idea of a life space and think about how, for not just for young people, but for the mothers, the parents, the families, generations were constrained, put into aspect during COVID,
yeah,
unable to separate or to bring in your partner or to flex your muscles in some way, emotionally, psychologically, physically. We have a lot still to deal with, and I think adolescence could be a lifelong process for us
yeah,
if we allow it.
yeah. Well, thank you, John.
Can I just leave you with one final thought, which is that
Please.
if people are worried about how adolescence is and how long it goes on for, pity the
Yeah.
poor Greenland shark. They live about 400 to 500 years on average, and they hit adolescence around age 150, and it goes on for 20 years.
Okay.
So we have it. And there is a functional, this isn't a pathological state. The aim is to re energize the herd and to shake us up a bit and think, now, how are we going to go forward as a community?
Brilliant.
And do come and join CAEAIG. It's open to all, Liberty Hall.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.